Thanks for joining us on the Talking Leadership TV Best Practice Network podcast series. And I'd like to introduce my co-host Kevin Bennett, who is the Queensland and New South Wales facilitator for the Best Practice Network. The network has members in Australia, New Zealand and Vietnam, and their guiding mantra of inspire to challenge, support to succeed helps to facilitate a range of activities, events and online forums which are aimed to connect like-minded organisations to fast-track their performance through shared learning, expertise, experience and resources. The Best Practice Network is focused on improving knowledge of best practice, and developing leadership capability is at the core of what it delivers to its members. Kevin's had operational leadership roles across multiple sectors and industries. He has a passion for continuous improvement and lifelong learning, with a focus on developing capabilities of the many teams he's worked with. I'd now like to turn to our guest for today's podcast. Dr Stephen Morse is the founder and CEO of Unchained Solutions Proprietary Limited, a Sydney-based consultancy that equips Australian organisations to comply with the Australian Modern Slavery Act 2018. Stephen has over 25 years of experience in entrepreneurial leadership in the not-for-profit and private sectors, both in Australia and overseas. He's a seasoned public speaker, thought leader and strategist, and brings his perspective to the fight against modern slavery and related human rights violations and their implications on supply chains. He obtained his doctorate in human trafficking intervention through the Fuller Theological Seminary in 2016 and an MBA in entrepreneurship through the University of Technology Sydney in 2020. He currently serves on the advisory board of the Freedom Business Alliance, the Ethics Committee of the Australasian Supply Chain Institute, and the Communications Working Group of the Commonwealth 8.7 Network. This podcast focused on modern slavery and implications for leadership. Thanks for joining us again, but enough from me. I'll hand over to our guest Stephen and my co-host Kevin.
Hello and welcome to this Talking Leadership Best Practice Network podcast. So really glad to, and I think we're going to tackle a great topic today, something slightly different, but we're still going to tie it back into the elements of leadership, values, behaviours and roles across industries, especially around Australia, New Zealand. So welcome back to my co-host Eric. How are you?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
No, very good. Looking forward to this one, Eric. And I think we'll have some great links back to our previous podcast. And Stephen, hello, Stephen. We are looking forward to today. We've met a few times. So how are you? And are you ready for today?
Yeah, Kevin, I'm doing well. It's towards the end of the week, as always. Thursdays, probably one of the hardest days, but we're almost there. But no, I enjoy every day, and looking forward to talking with you this morning about a critical issue, which is very close to my heart, something I've been focused on for such a long time, and looking forward to seeing how it grows and the momentum builds over the next few years.
Yeah, no, fantastic. So let's get into that then, Stephen. So I'll capture it as modern slavery, and especially I want to really get a feel out for the context. And I know you've got a lot of passion for it, so which would be fantastic for us. But like I say, what we then want to do is explore what it means from a leadership perspective. So if you could just give us just a brief overview at the minute, just put some context around what it is, what you're seeing, and just some of the key challenges at the moment.
Sure. Well, I pitch myself as a contemporary expert on the impact of modern slavery on Australian businesses. That term modern slavery has been used a lot, particularly in the Australian context and in the region, and really points to a human rights violation that's impacting more than 50 million people, according to recent estimates by the Global Slavery Index. What slavery is, well, in an acute form, it's really the removal or the severe restriction of a person's movement or their voice or their choice. The lack of agency is really a very key dynamic in the concept of modern slavery. It's very difficult to pinpoint cases of modern slavery, and modern slavery, according to some, sits on a continuum. And so it's like in terms of the spectrum of work and free work, and enterprise agreements, slavery sits really at the extreme end of workplace exploitation, and it affects people in different ways. One of the largest categories of slavery has to do with forced labor, which means people working in factories or on farms or in fisheries.
Okay, so in terms of where we're our context of Australia, New Zealand, as we are with, of course, obviously the best practice network. Is it something that is something that's been recent, or is it just something that's always been in the sectors? And you called up a couple of sectors there. So is it something we've been dealing with for quite a while? And what's driven the interest or the higher focus at the moment?
Yeah, well, slavery's been with us for a very, 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 very long time, and even in the Australian context since the establishment of colonies and this nation. So I don't have all the figures with me, but those, for example, Indigenous Australians, people living in the islands who have come to this country to help build this country, many of them have been impacted by modern slavery, and there have been many slave owners operating in this country through the development of Australia. So it's been with us for a long time. The question is, how much have we actually been dealing with it? And that really, the question then has returned to recent years. So in terms of actually having hard legislation, such as anti-slavery legislation, and we have two in Australia. We have a Commonwealth legislation called the Modern Slavery Act, and we have a one for New South Wales, because we like to be special in New South Wales, called the Modern Slavery Act as well, of the same title, but they have slightly different focus areas. The Commonwealth is the biggest focus is really around business, addressing the issues around the private sector, and not-for-profit organisations, as well as some government entities at the Commonwealth level. The state one for New South Wales targets mainly state-owned entities and departments and local government areas, and has a big focus on providing care services pathways for assistance for those who are impacted in this state.
So just in terms of business then, under those acts, if I'm a business leader, a senior business director or board, is in terms of what some of the obligations that I have from a leadership perspective, or obligations or expectations around knowledge and awareness?
There's a lot that needs to be done at both the board and the governance level, particularly when we look at the Commonwealth Act. So it does target and focuses on organisations that generate more than 100 million in annual consolidated revenue. What this really means then, the Act has a reporting mechanism, and companies, if we think about it, companies need to provide a statement on an annual basis, reporting in on what they've done to, first of all, identify risks, second of all, what they've done to address those risks, and third of all, how they're measuring the impact of those two activities. All that ties back to the governing representative, those who are authorised to represent the company in a legal and a judicial sense. And so it's really from the top, whether it's directors, senior executives, board directors, they need to actually be on top of this issue. They need to be those who are actually setting the agenda, setting the goals, providing the executive sponsorship, the investment that's required to actually do the work, do the due diligence work, and actually allocate resources and make sure that their organization has the right capabilities to actually do the due diligence in this space.
I have a question, Kevin, if I may. Stephen, thank you for the introduction, mate. When you mentioned that 100 million figure at the Commonwealth level, is that for an individual business or for an industry in total?
That's an industry. That's a business. So
okay.
That's a business. So if you're a business, you're an organization, and you're at that level or above, and we're looking at over 4,000, 5,000 companies in Australia that would be in that category, then you are obligated under the Commonwealth Act to report in to the Australian Border Force with a statement, comprehensive statement detailing and addressing certain key criteria on what you're doing to identify, address, and measure the impact. How this impacts smaller businesses? Well, this is where the market dynamics come in. And so whilst the Act does target the big end of town, there is a knock-on effect through the market, and we have seen that. So we do have smaller entities that are under that threshold who are voluntarily opting in, and there's provision for them to do so. But we're also seeing, because of the way of business works, so there are many organizations, companies within Australia who are in the B2B supply chain space. And this is where the rub is. So it becomes the business case. So if you want to therefore tender for business with a large organization that is reporting in, part of their reporting criteria is they need to assess risk throughout their supply chain. You are probably in the direct line of that if you're in the Australian context, and therefore you might be required to self-report, like a self-assessment questionnaire. You might be required to develop some policies around human rights or ethical sourcing, for example, or a code of conduct. You might need to put in some training, awareness training for your organization. You might, and this trend has been developing over the last 4 years since the legislation was in place, you might now need to start collaborating with your corporate client to do with them as a key component of their supply chain, and actually assist them to drill down through the supply chain and help them to identify risks beyond the shores of Australia. So that dynamic, whilst you're not mandated in a legal sense, there's very much a business case for actually, I suppose, the best word is alignment. And we're going to see that at the New South Wales level. So whilst the New South Wales Act targets government entities, you've got to think that New South Wales procurement is a $34 billion spend.
Yeah, wow.
It's the largest in Australia. So if you want to do business with New South Wales entities, then you're going to have to step up in the tender process and demonstrate that you're doing something to address this issue. So this is where the rub hits.
What is the obligations on government to source imports from countries where slave labour is a key issue? And I'm thinking here, a lot of the imported food that we get comes from nations where, and I won't mention any nations here, but that have questionable human rights practices. And why would smaller businesses be wanting to engage here if they see government flouting conventions around modern slavery, where we're being asked to scan our supply chains and be careful who we deal with? So if it's good enough for industry, why isn't it good enough for government, particularly in a competitive space? I'm outsider looking in here asking that question.
Yeah, well, it's not good enough for government. So if you think about, both at the Commonwealth level, there are Commonwealth entities that have their own reporting mechanism to comply with the Commonwealth Act. At the state level for New South Wales, the actual focus on supply chains is on government. So government has to actually step up first, at least in the state of New South Wales at this stage, to actually ensure that the goods and services that they're procuring are not free from slavery. So it very much is coming from government. And flow throughs to the private sector.
Great. So, a question I've got for you. There's a few things going around in my head at the minute, and I suppose it's about how things all start to come together. So, has the focus on the environmental with the ESGs and all this type of thing, has that been a help or a hindrance in terms of leaders? Because that's quite demanding at the minute, in terms of, especially as you would know, some of the reporting. So, in your view, for leaders in the business, if they're looking at the environmental, and I went to a talk the other day, and they talked about no one being left behind, and there's all these goals and targets globally. So is it a natural fit into that environmental sustainability pathway, which includes these ethical supply chains? And how is that helping then or hindering the discussions you're having with leaders? Because sometimes it can take over and go, no, I've got to do this, Stephen. I've just got to do this. But so how's that impacting? Is it helping or hindering? And how are you beginning to align leadership teams in to say this is actually an important part of doing business now?
Well, I think it should be helping, but it may be hindering. So let's go with that argument. So I think if you are actually in the process of mapping out your suppliers, identifying where key risks might be, issues, particularly in the area of environment, for example, you're trying to capture your carbon footprint, work out energy questions around the use of energy, the management of that energy in terms of waste management or water management, for example, that should actually fit in with other impact areas. And so as you're doing that side of the due diligence, there's no reason why you can't therefore integrate other due diligence work. For example, you might in that process then, bring in questions around diversity, equity, inclusion, gender equality, Indigenous procurement, attention to human rights. So I think part of the confusion at the moment is that we do have quite a growing beast, and I don't want to use that word too strong. It's kind of my word, but it's the ESG beast, right? And this is ESG reporting is massive, and comprises quite a number of very difficult, complex issues, and so that can really bring the overwhelm for business. How do I prioritize? How do I actually do this, which is going to cost me a lot when I'm also being asked to do this? And how can I work out how to integrate them so that it's not this siloed dynamic and it's not integrated? So that's part of the challenge, I think. And then how does this all tie in with my business as usual? Because I've actually got a business to run, and that's really one of the key complaints is like this seems to be I'm being pulled in a direction that's actually going to cost me, and I can't really see the clear business case for doing this work, and it's pulling me away from really my overall business purpose and strategy and the work that we actually do as an organization. So that the challenge there is to work out how can we integrate and develop the right strategy and the goals to actually integrate those key criteria or impact area criteria into to business as usual. That's a key challenge in leadership. We're going to come back to the question of leadership because I think this is where we're heading. How does this impact leadership? It's really about working out how to make sustainability in a broad category something which is no longer the exception, but actually something which is very much integrated, very much part of the DNA of how we do business. This is where we need to get to. We need to get to a place where attending to the environment, climate change, human rights, due diligence, this is all just part of business. This is not something which is just an exception. This is something which is just very much part of the very culture of who we are as a company. And we have clear targets and we have goals and we're working towards those goals. So and we know how to measure the work that we're doing. And they might start out very, very small. Because
sorry, Kevin, one follow-up question, Stephen.
Sorry, I should stop to give you an opportunity to ask
questions. No, that's okay. This is part of the discussion, Stephen, so all good. ESG reporting, my understanding is that at the moment it's voluntary, but in the future there may be moves to make it mandatory. Now, in a voluntary context, the pitch that you're talking about is a lot more difficult, but once it becomes mandatory, I think the outcry to harmonize how reporting is done in this context and what Kevin's talking about is critical, because and I can see this writ large, the pushback that will come is how long do businesses really need to spend on this level of reporting, and what does it mean for their bottom line? Because the inadvertent issue here is, do you need to then set up, the bigger the business is, a whole unit to make sure that you're reporting in the right way? Whereas potentially an opportunity, Kevin, is to set up automated systems to be able to report, to make sure that it's not impacting on how you can report. And I'm thinking here, smaller end of town, not bigger end of town, because your bigger corporates will have this embedded in what they do, because they're going to have shareholders screaming out, what does this look like for us? What's the reporting look like? So just an observation, Kevin. This gets complicated, and I understand now why. So thank you for that explanation, mate.
Well, I think it's interesting, because I think, and again, I'll be interested This is so we've definitely related about the strategy, in terms of thinking about, especially where your business wants to be, in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time. This is one of those, you've called it a beast, but this is one of those I think is going to come. It's going to come, and sooner or later, and the problem is going to be, if we don't start to put it on the agenda, you find out when it's too late. When someone phones up and says, "Did you know, by the way, that X or Y?" The other thing I want to so there's a couple of things I want to explore. So we're definitely tying this back to we've got to start to having it on the radar. So the way I see maybe a help at the minute is the fact, if you're already looking at something like the environmental stuff, you can start to just add a couple of questions maybe. So you're already doing your due diligence. You're already starting to ask the questions. It's just about, as a leadership, you've got to come up. And there's two elements I'm thinking of here. One, I'm also hearing, especially from the environmental, is, all right, yes, we've got to wait for our corporate or our shareholders, but there's a lot of pressure coming up from employees now in the community. There's becoming an expectation about, what are you doing? Are you sustainable in what you're doing? And I think there's as this awareness grows, this could be something that, and we all know the skilled labor, people labor at the minute, this could be something that people are looking for and going, I want to work for a company that's got this awareness. Or, if you, so, I think there's a bit of a thing we need to start to think about. This actually could be a strategy to recruit people. There's a little bit of way
exactly.
The other thing I'm thinking is I was at a session the other day, and what they were saying is that when organizations start to struggle with you can obviously get this, what they call the greenwashing, which is the false claim. So I don't know what your terminology would be there, but they also shared another term called the green hushing, where basically people just don't want to share. It's about, if I don't talk about it, I don't have to worry about it. Therefore, I don't have to put it on the agenda. And I think this is part of the leadership challenge at the minute, because it's easier to do nothing or say, I've got other priorities here.
Yep.
But as a leadership team, if it's something, and again, part of it is really about pulling out that it is relevant to us indirectly or directly. What's the sort of leadership things about getting it on the agenda and not being frightened to ask the question?
Yep.
Can I make a one observation, Kevin? I think the fear, and I've seen this in some of the sectors that I've worked in, is around reputational risk. When you're talking about this stuff, so if you're under-reporting or not reporting properly, what does it mean for you? And if you're sourcing, let's say, and Stephen, you talked about your supply chain and understanding what that looks like. Say you fix a supply chain from businesses X, Y, Z, and they're not crash hot on reporting, but they're the cheapest way for you to get your product out. Does it mean you're going to get pressure on your business to go with other suppliers that are more expensive because they meet the certain ticks that they need of approval from regulatory agencies? And this, I can see the negativity coming quite quickly, because from a business context, you need to grow your business, but try and source the best priced materials where you can, keeping these other things in mind. And so I can see that tension potentially there, and why this is going to be an issue, not just a bottom line issue, but then the reputational risk that comes with it. And some businesses will genuinely not know what they need to do or should be doing. And so the education bit is the bit that fascinates me. It says, how do you, one, tell people what they don't know, and two, how do you get them to adopt and see what is the final business case that can be made to adopt some of the things that you're talking about, outside of just common humanity and wanting not to screw people over. I get that bit, but from a cold hard business perspective, how do you build a business case going the other way?
In terms of reputation, where am I going to find myself, or where do I want to be in order to maintain my license to operate? Kevin, you talked about the pressure coming upwards from employees. So there's that whole question around the employer value proposition. It's no longer the case that I need to consider the value of my employees. I need to actually have value to my employees, if I'm going to keep them. The business case then is obvious. Recruitment and human resource management is an expensive area. So you can save money simply by integrating the perspective of your employees, and retaining them is actually is a cost saving to your organization.
Yeah.
I'm sort of trying to think through how do I best think about the other questions that you've put towards me. But I think, in terms of coming back to that point of leadership, it's really about, working out, first of all, where do I start? Well, you're gonna have to start with who is it that you want to do business with, and what is it that they want from you.
Yep.
Because coming back to the whole question around ESG reporting, and yes, there's at this moment there's a voluntary dynamic to it. We haven't quite arrived at a place, whilst there is various frameworks globally to kind of set the standards. At this stage, all the corporate clients that you have will have their own standards, and they're all learning as well. They're all trying to work out according to what, say, the ASX wants, in terms for them to remain in that context as well. So everyone is in a learning space and trying to work out what is it that we actually care about, and how do we actually manage the multiplication of concerns, when on the one hand, operationally, for example, I've got people in my team, I need to be very much concerned about diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, gender equality. Domestically in Australia, I need to start considering around, Indigenous companies and where I'm procuring from. And then more internationally, because that's where most of the risks are, I need to think through actually how my products are being made that I'm bringing into the country. And overarching all that, what is the overall environmental footprint of that enterprise? So I think, yeah, there's pressure upstream and downstream. And coming back to it, this is a question for leadership of actually setting some very clear targets wherever you are in your business. If you're at a startup level, if you're an SME, is to actually be able to take some time with your team to step back and actually in a sense, be proactive in setting your own targets for yourself, and coming up with a strategy to actually meet those targets, because you are going to be pushed and pulled in a number of directions, and so you don't want to be in the hushing dynamic, because that's not going to lead to business viability in the future. And you also need to be very careful about greenwashing, because there's a big clamp down on that as well, but that's mainly at the big end of the town. I don't know if that's answered all the questions that were raised in the last 5 minutes, but I'm happy to continue the conversation.
No, that's okay. And then this is why we love doing this, because we have a plan, but we don't, that plan can move across to deal with it. But I think there's also potential upside here, because if you start to ask the questions and you actually find out that the outcome could actually be a lot better than what you think. Yes. So, you could have things in place that you didn't realize, that you could be working with suppliers or customers that are actually heavily into this. And it could sometimes, just by having questions and being on the agenda of leadership, could help you secure an order or be more respected in the network. So there's always this upside here about, and this is this leadership bit. You've almost got to be a little bit brave, inquisitive to start to open the agenda. But I think it's also part of the other conversation we were having across the network and some other groups, is we just got to start asking some simple questions, because you start to read, the acts, and you start to read some of and you go, this is just overpowering. It's just too much. It's too complicated, and so the session we had talking, around some of the environmental stuff, it was just basically just start to ask some basic questions. How do we do this? How do we ensure, and just start to get the conversation going. So one of them was about, just ask your team, and I've got an example here, is how do we support inclusion, diversity, and connect with our communities? Just leave it as a question, and then allow your team to go, well, we do this, we do that, we do that. And almost the compliance bit comes afterwards when you've got the information. And I think this is what in terms of from a leadership perspective, is complicated. Let's start to make simple. Let's start to have the conversation. At least then it starts to get it on the agenda, and almost don't be too worried about
I think so. If you're trying to just operate from, gosh, what do I need to do to be in alignment and comply, then you will burn out.
Yeah.
In that, if you're actually starting from a more interpersonal relational approach, and a more collaborative consultation process, a person-based approach or stakeholder-based approach, then you have an opportunity to cultivate the culture for change and actually work out where the real drivers are for that change. There are, we've been very successful recently in getting B Corp certification, which is a global standard. It took us 15 months to get this goal. But one of the benefits of doing, say, the B Corp assessment work, you can actually do the assessment without going on and applying to be certified and going that process. Yeah. But actually, because it's got the key impact areas around governance, your workers, your community, your environment, it's got all these impact areas with all those questions. That could be a very good tool, whoever you are as a business, to actually start thinking through, well, what are the key questions that we need to be asking in order to meet certain targets or to make a particular impact. It could be just a vehicle within a team context, a leadership context, to start thinking through, okay, we're going to focus on let's have a look at the governance structure of our organization. What are the key things that the big end of town are going to be looking for from us as an organization, and what could we start working on and allocate some resources to actually step up? And that could be maybe having a much more robust ethical policy portfolio, for example. And we can start building that over time so that we're ready. So when someone says, where's your human rights policy? Where's your policy on diversity, equity, inclusion? Where's your code of conduct? Well, we have that in place, and we've been building that. And there's lots of tools to get those kind of things in place.
Yep.
Kevin, you mentioned the interaction of business and keeping the question simple to start with. I would hazard a guess here that we already are compliant with a lot of regulations at the state and federal level anyway that would get some tick-offs here that need to be considered. So when you're looking at a business level, how you recruit, what are your recruitment policies, what are the policies that are already in place? And thank you for reminding me of this, Stephen, but I guess that I've had previously, not that we've done a joint podcast on, Kevin, but we'll get to that at one point, is with Jonathan Mamerel. From a legal perspective, what are the things that you've got in policy in place in your business that if you had a legal concern that you can go back and say, well, I've got these things already codified in my business? That won't be true of all businesses, but at least some are already starting to go down that track, already have them in place. So I think things like checklists of what have you got and what don't you have to paint the picture is, I think, a very easy step to go forward, Kevin, without having to worry about whether you're not compliant. Where that, I think, to end my point here, to where that will get difficult is in 5 to 10 years, if it does become mandatory under state and federal legislation, the kickback will get significant if you don't know how to do that basic stuff first, or you haven't bothered to look. And that, in some senses, and I won't speak for all leaders, but it could be seen as a failure of leadership because you didn't want to have that question, but didn't want to have that discussion, but right now, maybe it's not on people's radar. And so to say that you didn't want to have it is maybe disingenuous, because we don't know that we need to be having that particular level of conversation. So yeah, this is more complicated than I initially thought going into this. So if you'll excuse my questions and where I'm going with some of this, Stephen, because it opens up a lot of questions. This is probably my takeaway theme, and we're not even finished the podcast.
Well, I'm very happy to be an activator. So I like to activate conversation, and then let other people have the conversation.
Yeah, well, you've done that, mate. So I'll kick back to Kevin.
Yeah, well, I just want to reinforce on that, and again, I've been like myself. You can go well, but I think, as you said, Stephen, I think you covered up Eric as well. A lot of this, it isn't always about creating something new here. You know, in terms of it's developing and expanding some of the questions. So, like you say, you know, we already, you know, what's our procurement policy? You know, so the chances are we've got a procurement policy. It's about what's some simple things that we can just start to ask now. You know, recruitment policy, or you know, what. So I think it's getting that, and whether there is a framework, like you say, with the B Corp that just gives you those type of questions, then you know, even if you're small, you still got some idea about this is what I'd like to do, you know, and some of the values and behavior. So I think, you know, from a leadership team is about sometimes we just got to keep it simple. We just got to keep it going, but start to have the conversation. But the key I want to key out here is about, we go back to the leadership now, but they've got to be starting to have the conversations, and that can be where it's challenging. So if you've got a leadership team, you know, a couple of managers or larger in the corporates, what's some of the leadership as a leadership team, what sort of the values, behaviors and skills that they got to have, because this can be quite a, you know, when you're not discussing something for the first time, it's a little bit challenging. And I suppose if the back of your head you go, I don't know the answer, that's challenging as well. Or you ask the question and you already know, oh, I think we've got a problem here, because already you go, oh, now you've asked the question, you're right to deal with it. So when you're working with leadership teams, you know, what's some of the things that you're finding? Because the maturity of the leadership team to be able to have these type of discussions is going to be critical. Otherwise, it just becomes a don't do it. It's a compliance thing. Yeah. Any experiences there, good and bad, about where you've worked with teams who have just been able to start to get that conversation going?
Yeah, I mean, I think good practice here is where a leader of an organization, say that's the chief executive or of a director, is really being able to identify key people within the organization and expand the conversation. I mean, just coming back to the employer value proposition, this is a great opportunity to actually engage your younger workforce members who are in the conversation, who are very much, this is part of on their agenda. So work out how you can actually bring them into the conversation. That part of the connecting with, you know, Gen Y, Gen Zs is that they want to be heard. This is part of, they want to be part of the conversation. They want to be part of the decision making. So this is a very, very obvious place to start, is actually to harness their knowledge, harness their skills, harness their interests, because they'll know where they can get the information from. A lot of this is part of where do I get information from? Where do I actually get the tools and the resources to actually do this work? And I have that within my own organizations. Like, I don't know where I can find this, and I'll give this to a younger member of their team, and they'll come back to me at the end of the day with all the stuff. And I'm like, oh, great. Good. Let's move on. So I think that's part of it, is being able to broaden the develop and broaden the conversation. One of the key, most successful organizations when it comes to issues around, say, human rights violations, is where they do have a designated working group of people who are actually assigned, resourced, and equipped to actually do the work for the organization and drive the conversation. So organizations need like an ambassador, like a champion, or within the organization who can actually drive the conversation and see how it can integrate into different functions and divisions within that organization. So I think that's probably where it needs to work. Where it doesn't work, and where I haven't seen good practice in terms of where I'm working with, is where it basically becomes a tick and flick. It's like we've just got to throw a statement together, and it's June 30. We need to have a statement, and there is really no functioning team to actually drive the implementation, and therefore it just becomes, oh look, we just need to get this statement out, and we don't really have any clear targets of what we're going to do next. So one of the key components of the Modern Slavery Act is this continuous improvement dynamic. So you need to, in the same breath, you need to first of all state what you're doing, and then state what you're going to do next. And then the next year you report on what the next was, and how effective that was. Well, if you don't have the right mix of people in the team to actually help articulate what those next steps are and how we're going to actually do those steps and measure the effectiveness of those steps, then you don't have anything to report in the next year. And then that brings you back to a very minimal action plan, which then lends itself to greenwashing, because you're saying you're doing something and you care about modern slavery, but actually you have no clear strategy to actually address this issue.
Yep.
And then you find yourself maybe unwittingly, because you're so busy, that actually we don't really care. We're just doing this. It's just a tick and flick, and it has no bearing on our organization, and we don't have anyone assigned or sponsored within the organization to drive the implementation through the different aspects of the business. If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. Again, again going back to our group that we've got, around about the business improvement, the continuous improvement, the problem solving is a lot of the business will have those type of skills already. Okay. Yep. It's just what they don't know is what the standard and what the gap is to then kick in the resulting actions at the end of the day, and we always say, unless you at least got a standard, at least know where you're aiming for, and then how you're performing, then you've got a gap. Therefore, I now know what I need to, or you make a choice, because you don't tackle everything, but obviously you make a choice around doing it. So, most good leadership teams will have the type of skills to do this. It's just opening up the conversation. To start to have that. Can I just ask, because it's a topic that I've been talking about the last couple of weeks, and I'm assuming you've come across, where does this fit in with things around the psychosocial hazards and all that's going on at the minute? Because they talk about poor support, low role clarity, poor workplace relationships, bullying, harassment, remote or isolated work. So is that something that, again, you feel is another one that's going to support, or is it suddenly going to be another tag where say, oh, sorry, Stephen, I've got to talk about psychosocial now, I can't talk about a lot of these just seem to be coming in twine, and my fear is about we see it as 5 separate things.
They're very much integrated. So we need to think, if we wanted to think of building out from the interior to the exterior, how we think about our supply chain will very much, I think, mirror how we actually operate within the organization. So, we need to attend. I mean, if you think, I'll just go the question around gender equality. Okay, well, the largest group of people at risk of being exploited in forced labor or domestic servitude are women and girls. Okay, so this is very much a gender issue. Addressing human rights violations on the whole is a gender issue. So they're not separated. But that can all tie back into how we address those issues within the interior life of our organization. And we can actually, if we can get our house in order, if you like, and actually cultivate an environment where people are supported, where we do address those social psycho issues, where we do address issues of bullying, harassment, that there's no reason why that can't actually flow out to actually having a much more integrated and fairer approach to how we address the broader ecosystem of our business. So I think we need to, we definitely need to think, and one of the things I do with my clients is, particularly when it comes to measuring impact, you need to think about your ecosystem. A lot of organizations think, I just want to minimize the risk of slavery. It's like, but you're so far removed from anyone who's actually exploited. That's not a clear target. So come back to where do you operate? Where does your business operate in the ecosystem of, and who is around you? Who are key, your competitors, who could be your peers, who might be able to support you. So that changes the dynamic. Who's above, below you, around you, investors, tenants, and how do you operate, and therefore where can you actually leverage change, where can you affect change, and where can you perhaps get support to actually shape the culture and develop the culture, both of the the operational life of your business and the value chain of your business. So the conversations don't have to be separated. Coming back to that original conversation around that, we need to work out how we can integrate, have a framework which is integrating all those kind of dynamics, however small, but the conversation doesn't have to be divorced. Human rights is not out there, it's in here.
Yeah. And I like again the contextualize for your own business, your own environment. I think is something which has to be done and has to be important. Otherwise you do run the risk of tick and flick, or just not in my backyard, or things like that. And I think again we go back to the leadership point of view. It's that good governance, there's good systems, those good reporting systems, but then the leadership then has to say, well, now I know that, what does it really mean? And where does that fit into my strategy or my plans? Even down to, like you say, a recruitment policy, in terms of who our market is from there. So I think that there's definitely something around some of the core, I think in a lot of good businesses, we've got the core capability. It's just about now getting the heads around contextualizing it and start to ask the right questions.
Yeah, and taking those policies, I mean, the risk with a policy is that it just sits on someone's file and no one looks at it, right?
Yeah.
So effective policy development is where there's a socialization or an integration into the business. So there's a training, capacity building component so that people actually know how to actually implement the policy. So there's procedures and checklists, and then there's a feedback loop, so that people can actually respond to the policy and work towards continuous improvement. So policy, so even just on that point of governance, it's not like, right, we've got this policy in place and that's it. That's the standard. We need to integrate into all those kind of things, a conversation, so that we're continually improving upon what we have. And there's people are buying in to the decision making and to the standards that we're actually setting.
There's a capacity and capability issue here, Stephen, that is screaming out at me now that we're almost an hour into the conversation. That I get where you're coming from. I wasn't as schooled up as I probably should have been on this, and I will do my own reading when we get off this call, because I've got probably more questions than we've got time to deal with here. But one thing I see here is that the larger corporates, the bigger businesses that have got the people capacity to do this, are going to adapt a lot quicker and a lot better because they've got that capacity in the business. And then you talk about capability, and I think this one around leadership, and Kevin's come back to this a couple of times, is some big businesses are governed by boards and then CEOs, GMs, and big leadership teams, but a lot of the businesses I've dealt with and Kevin deals with in the network are not in that league. Not that they don't want to be, but they don't have those capabilities in-house. So you might be talking a very small team, no governance board to speak of. So how this gets more fully rolled out gets nuanced, and I think there's a very big space here for people to come in and develop checklist processes that are aimed at different size businesses in different industries, because this will get more nuanced depending on your industry as well. That's not to say nothing should be done about it, or at least a conversation not had, but this this is a lot more bloody complicated than I first thought, gentlemen. And I guess I would hate this to be the case, but industries don't react well when you come in with forced legislation, because then you'll end up in the situation that you talked about a tick and flick exercise and poor planning. Now, to be honest, the planning process we have already in other areas is not great in some businesses. So add this on top, it's not going to get any better if you don't know how to integrate your people to push things forward. And that then really does come back to what's your capacity in your business to do any of this.
Look, I think, you might think, a larger organization has the capacity to simply just augment their existing risk management framework or their governance structure. Okay, that's fine, but that doesn't mean that that developing a change in culture is going to happen any more easily than a smaller organization. I think actually it's probably the reverse. It probably is easier with a smaller organization to actually change the culture of how you're doing things than a larger one, because there's a lot of baggage. And
agreed. I'm not saying it's going to be any easier.
You might be able to make things look really good and have a very slick, sophisticated reporting structure. We've got a whole page on sustainability and look at all our targets. That does not necessarily reflect the reality of what's going on within that organization. I can assure you, as you know.
Yeah. Sure, I completely understood. Yes.
All right, so I think let's start to bring this together, and I think it's as normal, Eric. This is one of these podcasts could lead to a whole bunch of different topics, and I think I don't think this is going to be the last time we're going to be talking to you, Stephen, about what.
Well, we could just scroll out a series if you got more questions.
No, exactly right. We'll see what feedback we get and everything else. But I think a couple of things for me. It's about, obviously there is awareness of what the of the topic we're talking about, in terms of what the impact is. I think there's the relevance back into, how do we just start to have that conversation now, and you don't have to create something new. They can just ask a couple of questions, and maybe the B Corp, is it something that just starts to ask the questions? But I think a takeaway is as businesses, especially, we've got to contextualize this. Is about where's the risk, where's the impact. I've got to make a start now, and especially if this could be an opportunity. It's easy to see this as a risk, therefore a threat, but it could also be an opportunity. So, you've got to look at these things as leadership teams and say, well, I know it's sitting there, but let's be the half glass full here and say this actually could be a great opportunity for us. And like you say, there might be some people in the business who've got a passion for this, or have got and sometimes there's great good news out of these things that if we don't ask the questions, we never get to hear about.
Ever the optimist, Mr.
Always
Bennett.
the optimist. Always the optimist. But going back to
every challenge is an opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Challenge and opportunity. Always something that we can always look at opportunities. So, but let's go back just to close out. We really like to do this. And again, this is Eric. I know, you're in terms of the podcast we've done. So from a leadership perspective, Stephen, so let's just, and I'm very happy to, take this back to the topic. So, if I'm a business leader here, and whether it's a small business or large business, what's the sort of things that, from a leadership perspective, whether it's around this topic or generally, what's just those couple of tips about, this is things that start to think about what you need to start to be doing now and start to get on to the agenda. So what would be your top 3 tips in terms of, from a leadership perspective, now taking it to the next level?
Sure. Well, I think we need to come back to our overall business plan and strategy, and part of that conversation is work out, who are we as an organization, and where do we want to be in the next 5 to 10 years, and what are our key, what do we want to be about as an organization, what do we want to be known for? So I think that part of let's just come back to the real basics, the real sort of heart of who we are as an organization, and in the process of that, then second point is to bring then people into that conversation, to start thinking through how we can integrate, the ESG dynamic into the DNA, which is kind of part of my keynote conversation. How do we embed the ESG into the DNA of our organization? And then I think from there is to then identify, according to who we are as a company, where we can actually start, augmenting or adopting changes into our existing framework. So as you say, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to actually build on your own current capabilities and current structures, and perhaps where there might be some gaps. So you could do a gaps analysis. Where are some very obvious gaps? Things really quick, really low-hanging fruits that we can actually quickly do to actually get a better operational framework in place, and policies could be a very key one, and procedures and checklists, procedures especially, to actually look at them and quickly work out, okay, well, this is what we're going to focus on in the next 6 to 12 months. We're going to actually just build out our policy portfolio to actually make sure that we've got a more robust. So I think it's really about working out, coming back to the basics, integrating people in, setting some very clear goals of where you want to be, and where perhaps you want to make where you want to make an impact in your local community. Because that's a key thing. How can we actually, where are we in our environment, and where could we actually form some partnerships in that space. But then work out, what are the low-hanging fruit that we can actually do in the short term, whilst we're actually building out some key strategies around the environment, or diversity, equity, inclusion, or human rights, or modern slavery over the long term. I think there's some key things. So it's really coming back to reframing the conversation of who we are as an organization and where we want to be and who's going to be part of that journey. And in that process, you can then cultivate a change and affect change within the organization and stimulate people within the organization to have a much clearer vision and purpose for who you are and what they're actually part of.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think there's, even just from a starting the modern slavery discussion, but I actually quite like, I'm sitting here thinking that's just a great little takeaway for anything we're challenging. And whether you're a startup, you could be just going through what you said before, whether you're an existing business or you're looking to change. There's some great tips there in terms of just bringing it all together, have the conversation, finding out where you're playing, and obviously trying to get that conversation going. So obviously we would encourage people to learn more. But I think you could use that for that topic. But I think what you've just summarized there, and will be recorded, which is great, is something that businesses could just be generally doing more and more of, and having those discussions and building up that leadership capacity and capability. If we're having discussions now, it's not such a shock or a surprise. So I think that's a fantastic one, Stephen, to close off from that point of view. Eric, any last perspectives on your takeaways from today?
In a more general sense, maybe macro look at this from, I'm just coming at this from a leader perspective. Kevin and Stephen is more about how do leaders implement and have difficult conversations around topics that people really may have never engaged with, or to build understanding on a topic area like this. And I think for lots of businesses that you deal with, Kevin, that I deal with, this will be a first conversation around this. And so how do you broach the topic? And for those in many of our businesses that will be hard-nosed around, well, what's in it for me discussion, then trying to understand what are the business benefits here, and why have the conversation at all? Because I did use the term at the start of the podcast, reputational risks in general. These are things that are front and center in most leaders' minds in their businesses of whatever kind. And I think the conversation can be turned around to, outside of the profit motive for being in business, which, let's face it, we're all in to make some money here. No one's doing this for free. Is what is the social element of our responsibilities there, over and above the environmental stuff, which is all critical stuff if you're understanding and engaging in things like ESG, for example. And I think it's a nuanced conversation from a leadership point of view, and one that is necessary to keep having. So that would be my takeaway, gentlemen.
Yeah, no, fantastic. It's a great one. Well, Stephen, can I thank you very much? I'd like to say we have caught up a couple of times before, but it's been fantastic just to really talk around this this whole topic, and I'm hoping it's really stimulated some thought and some discussions around how some of our leadership and our businesses, and I'm pretty certain that we will have you back again in terms of the context of where we've been talking about, and hoping, I think, whether through Eric's context or through the Best Practice Network, we can get some more engaging conversations going from there. So Stephen, thank you very much for your time. It is greatly appreciated.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Kevin. It's been a pleasure. I'm pleased that I've just opened up your minds to 1,000 questions. So very much happy to, and look forward to continuing the conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Great. No, it's been our pleasure, and I love it when I can see Eric's mind going bang.
Yes, I can see that too. It's kind of like I can see.
I think that's great. I think that's great. All right. Well, I'm going to thank everybody for being involved in this one, and obviously for listening to another Talking Leadership Best Practice Network podcast. We love your feedback on this one. It will be published very, very soon. And I think for us, Eric, if anyone is out there who wants to be involved, or anyone who has a topic they want to discuss, then find us out on LinkedIn, and we'll be happy to have a conversation with you.
Thanks again for joining us on the podcast. I'd like to thank my co-host Kevin Bennett from the Best Practice Network for his time and insights. And as always, we'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Stephen Morse, for sharing his insights on the topic of modern slavery. On Monday, the 10th of July, we head back to Talking Leadership TV and the Leadership Pathway of Dr. Karuna Ramanathan. Hope you can join us then. Take care, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Talking Leadership TV.